Good evening. I'm Father Jeff Hahnemann, the priest in charge of St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, Connecticut. And this is our adult Bible study, a production of St. John's as part of our online outreach to our parishioners and friends in this time of self-quarantine and pandemic, and made possible with the support of viewers like you. Let me begin again by introducing myself. I am an Anglican priest and have been for over 40 years. I was graduated in 1987 from Oxford University with a doctorate in the history of the early church. I am published in the field of the formation of the Christian Bible, and I am an internationally recognized expert on the Muratorian fragment, for whatever that's worth. But more importantly, I am a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. And as such, I want to know everything I can about him, about what he said, about what he did, about what he asks of us. So where do we as Christians find that information? And how do we as Christians know whether that information is trustworthy and accurate? How do we know what to believe? That's the underlying question. And these are the kind of questions that I, as a rational person, as a skeptic even, raise in my search to faithfully know and follow Jesus. And I invite you to join us in this study. So this is part 3 of what I have suggested would be a series of studies in our search for Jesus, in our series of future classes as we go further and further, deeper and deeper in that quest. In part 1, we acknowledge the fact that we are thousands of years separated from the life and times of Jesus and from those who recorded the details of his life, and that they recorded those details in languages that are ancient and foreign to us. And that language in and of itself is difficult to interpret sometimes, that meanings can change or become lost over time, or that translations can mislead us, or that later tradition reads back sometimes into texts interpretations that are simply not there, or at other times may not be there. We looked at only a few of those many questions that occur in a biblical translation in part 1 of this series, which is available on the St. John's YouTube page. If you haven't seen it yet, I commend it to your attention first. In part 2, also available on the St. John's YouTube page, we explored the struggle to determine the original texts of our biblical sources, acknowledging that there are thousands of different manuscripts of the New Testament, and new ones may still yet be found, and that there are thousands upon thousands of variations in those texts, and the decision as to which is most authentic is not always apparent and not always easy. In some cases, scribes added to smooth out the abruptness of the scriptures, like with the Lord's Prayer or the ending of the Gospel of Mark. Scribes at other times corrected texts that they knew or thought were mistaken, like the beginning of Luke's Gospel, its misleading reference to the prophecy of Isaiah. Other times, scribes altered the text to better fit their own understanding of who Jesus was, like with that voice at his baptism and what it said, or Jesus's encounter with the leper in Mark. Many times the texts we assume were altered because of later tradition or theological considerations. There are lots and lots of questionable variations in the texts, as we saw in part 2. And our best, most complete codices, collections of the complete New Testament, are from the 4th century and onward. But that the patristic fathers and their writings of the 2nd and 3rd century often have different readings even still. Thus, we need to always approach the biblical text with some hesitation and with some familiarity with the writings of the early church fathers. So we have problems not only with translations, but we also have problems with textual variations. Today, our concerns, with those concerns in mind, we want to start looking at the details about the life of Jesus within the 4 canonical Gospels. You know, the so-called Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. First, we must note, however, that the suggested authorship of these Gospels is derived from later tradition, not from the texts themselves. The manuscripts of these Gospels are anonymous, and the ascriptions to the apostles Matthew and John, to the physician Luke, and to Mark, the translator of Peter, these ascriptions were made later and are somewhat disputed. It is clear from the scriptures themselves that there were, quote unquote, many accounts of the life of Jesus at the time the so-called Gospel of Luke was written. That, of course, raises the question whether any of those other contemporary accounts known to the author of the Gospel of Luke are known to us today, or if so, whether they are accepted into the canon of Scripture. And if others are later found, would they become part of the Bible, part of the canon of Scriptures? I will look at the question of the formation of the New Testament in part 4 of this Bible study. For the time being, it is clear from the first lines of the so-called Gospel of Luke that the author himself was not an eyewitness to the events described, and that he knew of many other written sources about the life of Jesus. Even so, with all these written sources known in the first century, many early church leaders preferred the oral tradition over the written. For instance, Papias. Papias was a Greek apostolic father, the bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, who lived roughly 60 AD to 130 AD. Now, very little is known about Papias apart from what we can infer from his own writings. He was, interestingly enough, described by Papias's disciple Irenaeus, end of the 2nd century, as, quote, an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp. One question, of course, is which John is implied in this reference from Irenaeus, the student of Polycarp? Oh, the work of Papias itself is dated by many scholars to be about 95 to 110. And at that time, surprisingly perhaps, Papias prefers oral tradition over the information from books, as he says. Note also in this quote here that there's an apparent distinction made by Papias between, quote, the presbyter John and the earlier mentioned John among the apostles. One might note called epistles of John, in the epistles, the 2nd and 3rd letter of John, as we call them today, the first line identifies the author as the presbyter in Greek, or the elder. Was this the same presbyter John mentioned here by Papias? So this quotation from Papias seems to suggest that the so-called letters of John are from John the Elder and not John the Apostle. Yet even so, Irenaeus, Polycarp's disciple, who said that Papias and Polycarp were companions, will later suggest that the 4th gospel was written by John the Apostle at the end of the 2nd century, and not by the presbyter John. One wonders why. We may hint at that in a minute. Papias is also the earliest extant reference we have to the so-called Gospel of Mark, as you can see from this quote. The Gospel of Mark is generally thought to be the oldest of the 4 Gospels these days. Here also is found the tradition that Mark was Peter's translator, and that he wrote down Peter's account of the life of Jesus. However, it's also noted that the author of Mark was not an eyewitness to Jesus's life. He was not a follower of Jesus, Papias says, but only learned about Jesus from Peter. And Papias is also a little defensive about the Gospel of Mark here, confirming that the account is accurate, but not in order. So now, neither Luke nor Mark were apparently written by eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. Papias also provides the earliest extant reference to the Gospel of Matthew. Papias notes that Matthew collected the sayings of Jesus in the Hebrew language, and that everyone interpreted as he was able. The gospel we have, the gospel that we call Matthew, is not just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. but is a narrative of his life and actions. Moreover, the gospel we have is written in Greek, not in Hebrew. And scholars have confirmed that it cannot easily be translated backwards to Hebrew, suggesting it was not written in Hebrew and that what they have is a translation. So was Papias familiar with a different Gospel of Matthew than the one we have? Or was he simply mistaken? The idea of a gospel of just sayings of Jesus, just logia, one which failed to tell the stories of his birth or his miracles or his passion, death, or his resurrection, was considered by many over the centuries simply as unimaginable, at least until the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas. The so-called Gospel of Thomas was discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, in December of that year. It's among a group of books which collectively are known as the Nag Hammadi Library. Scholars speculate that these many books appear to have been buried, perhaps in response to Bishop Athanasius's letter, his Easter letter of 367, which set aside a clear canon of scriptures, and that all these works were not included. But more about that in part 4. Scholars have proposed the date of composition for the Gospel of Thomas as early as 60 AD, making it contemporary with our canonical Gospels, or as late as 140, making it perhaps written shortly after, at worst, of the last epistles of the New Testament. In this sense, then, it's considered a contemporary of the canonical Gospels. But unlike the canonical Gospels, it's not a narrative account of the life of Jesus. Instead, the so-called Gospel of Thomas consists of logia, only of sayings of Jesus, or attributed to Jesus, sometimes standing alone, sometimes embedded in short dialogues or in parables. I think there are 119 sayings of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. The text may contain a possible allusion to the death of Jesus in his telling of the parable of the wicked tenants, which is also paralleled in the Synoptic Gospels. But the so-called Gospel of Thomas doesn't mention Jesus' crucifixion, his resurrection, his birth, any sense of final judgment, and it doesn't mention a messianic understanding for Jesus. The introduction to the Gospel states this, quote, "These are the hidden words that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote them down," end quote. Didymus, which is a Greek word, and Thomas, which is an Aramaic word, both mean twin. They are translated as twin, explicitly suggesting this gospel was written by the Apostle Thomas, who was called the twin, John 21:2. Here, the author of the gospel is declared, as in some other later gospels, like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Judas, and is declared to be one of the 12. But the text authorship by Thomas the Apostle is still rejected by most scholars. Which brings us to the so-called synoptic problem, so named from the Greek words meaning seen all together. If one places the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, side by side, one will note an obvious literary connection of some kind. Too many of the stories there use too many of the exact same words and are recorded in too similar an order to suggest randomness. Thus, these 3 Gospels, often called the Synoptic Gospels, are thought to share some common literary source of one kind or another. Biblical scholars have been arguing about this for centuries, from the time of Origen in the 4th century. The general consensus is that the writers of the so-called Gospels of Matthew and Luke had a copy of the so-called Gospel of Mark in front of them as they wrote their own Gospels, adding other events from other sources, perhaps. Remember, at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, the author admitted that, quote, many had undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that had been fulfilled among them. However, if so, then the attribution to the Apostle Matthew of the gospel of that name seems unlikely, because it seems unlikely that the Apostle Matthew, an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, would need to rely so heavily upon a gospel attributed to a second-generation writer, as Papias describes Mark. The often slight alterations and additions among stories told by Matthew and Luke often give us hints about their theology and the timing of the writings. Here in Matthew's version of the parable of the Great Supper, odd details are changed or added, where the now king becomes so enraged that guests refuse to attend his son's wedding banquet that king sends his troops to destroy those murderers and burn their city to the ground. A rather severe reaction to someone refusing a wedding invitation, and not found in Luke. Many scholars suggest these additions confirm that Matthew's gospel was written after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD, and that the author is looking for some kind of explanation as to why this happened and what it means, as in his alteration of the parable of the Great Supper. Interestingly, this shared story in Matthew and Luke is not found in the Gospel of Mark. There are a number of such shared parables and sayings which have some literary connection between them. They're too similar to be random, and has led many biblical scholars to suggest that Matthew and Luke had another common source before them beside the Gospel of Luke, a source called by scholars Q, from the German word Quell, which means source in German. Along with Mark's priority, being the first of the Gospels written and therefore at hand for Matthew and Luke, Q has been hypothesized since 1900 and is one of the foundations of most modern gospel scholarship. This is the sort of two-source hypothesis for the writing of Matthew and Luke. The Q source, sometimes called the Q document or the Q gospel or simply just Q, is, remember, a hypothetical written collection primarily of Jesus' sayings, logia, written in Koine Greek. Remember Papias' earlier description of Matthew as a collection of sayings of Jesus, logia, in the Hebrew language. Remember the discovery of the so-called Gospel of Thomas in 1945, containing not the narrative of Jesus' life and actions, but only logia, sayings attributed to Jesus. Q, like the Gospel of Thomas, and like Papias' description of Matthew's Gospel, suggests that there may have been several different collections of Jesus' sayings or logia circulating in the very first years of the church, in the first century. If this two-source hypothesis is correct, then Q would probably have been a written document and not oral tradition. If Q was a shared oral tradition, it's unlikely that could account for the nearly identical word-for-word similarities between Matthew and Luke when quoting Q material. That's not found in Mark. Similarly, it's possible to deduct that Q was written in Greek. If the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were referring to a document that was written in some other language, like Aramaic or Hebrew, for example, it's highly unlikely that each would have a translation, an independent translation, that would have the exact same wording. The Q document may have been composed before the Gospels of Matthew. It would have to have been composed before the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, if it exists. And some scholars even suggest that Q predates Mark. A date for the final Q document is often placed in the 40s or 50s of the first century. In 1924, scholars began to suggest a third hypothetical source, referred to as M, or Special Matthew, and that it lies behind the material in Matthew that has no parallel in Mark or Luke, like his birth narrative, and that likewise some material presented only in Luke might also have come from an other unknown source, sometimes called L, or Special Luke. So the two-source hypothesis by many scholars has now become a four-source hypothesis, that they underline, these four sources underlie the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the Gospel of Mark, which we have, and three lost texts, Q, M, and L. The source M has a more Judaistic character to it if you look at that material separately. It's a little more Judaistic, like the Jewish Gospels, like the Gospel according to Matthew, for instance, or the Gospel of the Ebionites. And it suggests to many scholars that Jerusalem was its origin. Similarly, the source known as L, a hypothetical source, is more Hellenistic when you look at it, and it's often assigned to Caesarea. And the source Q has been connected with Antioch, where there was an ancient Christian school. The Q that derived there may have been an Antiochian translation of a document originally composed in Aramaic. Remember from the very first part of this series that what we do know with most confidence is that Jesus spoke Aramaic. It's actually quoted in our Greek New Testament. So that some have argued that in Antioch, at this ancient Christian school, they had a copy of Q written in Aramaic or Hebrew, like the one Papias refers to, and that they in Antioch translated it into Greek, and that it's that source in Greek, that translation, that's later become known to Matthew and Luke. Anyway, there appears to be a variety of early written sources there in the first century, like those mentioned by the so-called Gospel of Luke, or the author of Gospel of Luke, and that these various sources, written sources, appear to have contributed to the writing of what we call our canonical Gospels, the four Gospels in our canon, our list. Our canonical Gospels, then, are thus not necessarily, in fact, most apparently are not the earliest written text about the life of Jesus. And that the Gospel sources we have, our canonical Gospels, are apparently not written by eyewitnesses, despite the fact that later tradition will attribute them to the apostles John and Matthew, or Luke, the physician and companion of St. Paul, or Mark, the companion and interpreter to Peter. That brings us to the fourth Gospel, the so-called Gospel of John. The fourth Gospel is different from the Synoptic Gospels in a variety of ways. The Greek in which it is written is more refined and polished and poetic, for instance. This Gospel also focuses more on Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem than in Galilee, containing numerous stories of Jesus visiting Jerusalem, usually at the time of Jewish feasts. That's, for instance, where we get the idea that Jesus' public ministry lasted 3 years, because Jesus visited Jerusalem at least 3 times, according to the so-called Gospel of John, to attend the celebrations for Passover there. But he went at other times as well, celebrating other Jewish feasts. So in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is recorded as only going to Jerusalem once, at the end of his ministry. So the fourth Gospel has Jesus cleansing the temple early on in his public ministry, shortly after his baptism by John, while the Synoptic Gospels have him cleansing the temple only at the end of his life, the only time they have him going to Jerusalem. And some of my conservative literalists balance this by suggesting he cleansed the temple twice. I'm not so sure. Jesus also speaks differently in this gospel than he does in the Synoptic Gospels. In the other Gospels, Jesus tells stories and parables. In the other Gospel, he talks to common folk, like the woman at the well, or the tax collector, or simple fishermen by the lake, but not so much in John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, Jesus goes on in several long theological dialogues with crowds in Jerusalem particularly, and with crowds that follow him from Jerusalem. And he talks to them with ideas and images that we don't find in the first 3 Gospels. For instance, the description of Jesus as the Lamb of God is found only in the Gospel of John, which interestingly dates the day of Jesus' crucifixion differently than the Synoptic Gospels. In John's Gospel, Jesus dies on the day of preparation, the day before Passover, the day the lambs are sacrificed and killed for the Passover feasts. And sure enough, in John's Gospel, Jesus is referred to as the Lamb of God. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is crucified on the day of Passover, or the day after the eve of Passover, so that the Last Supper in the Synoptic Gospels is a Passover meal, where in John's Gospel, it is not so called. So this contrast between the Synoptic Gospels and John, and especially between the way Jesus speaks in the Synoptic Gospels and John, is best perhaps exemplified by the I am statements. You know, the places where Jesus says, I am, and then adds some kind of predicate, like I am the bread of life, or I am the light of the world, or I am the resurrection and the life, I am the vine, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the good shepherd. These are some of the most beloved sayings of Jesus. And yet none of these statements can be found in the other three Gospels. The I am statements are found only in John's Gospel. For a long time, scholars thought that the so-called Gospel of John was composed much later than the others, later than the canonical Gospels, because of its sophisticated theology and its more developed ecclesiology. Some scholars even speculated that the author composed the Gospel of John after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and that it was composed by somebody who was really unfamiliar with the city of Jerusalem, because he described things that others didn't know about, like the miracle at the pool of Siloam, which was unknown until its discovery in 1945 under the Arab neighborhood of Silwan. And then in 2004, archaeologists excavating that site for the Israelis Antiquities Authority found biblical marked coins marked with ancient Jewish writings and pottery shards and a stone bottle cork that confirmed the identity as the site of the biblical Siloam pool, so that now at least we know that the author of this gospel was indeed familiar with the city of Jerusalem, even with what would be insignificant and perhaps unknown to later generations. The fourth gospel is the so-called Gospel of John, is traditionally believed to have been written by the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, the brother of James. Yet the fourth gospel can't have been written by the Apostle John if Acts 4:13 is correct in stating that John, as well as Peter, were illiterate. That's the meaning of the Greek adjective used here, sometimes translated more softly as simply uneducated, but it literally meant that they were illiterate, which wouldn't be surprising to discover that Galilean fishermen were illiterate at that time. I think they estimate that only 4 to 10% of the population could read in the first century in the Roman Empire. It wouldn't be surprising that they were illiterate. It would be surprising to discover that the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, a Galilean fisherman, was not only literate, but capable of composing this gospel with its sophisticated Greek usage and complex theological ideas. Yes, John might have gotten a scribe to write it. That sometimes is argued to account for it. But John 21:24 suggests that the author wrote the gospel, not a scribe. John 24 seems to suggest that that author was a disciple of Jesus and not some scribe. And interestingly, remarkably, the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, the supposed author of this gospel by later tradition, is never actually mentioned in the gospel we call John. Moreover, all the events which are recorded in the Synoptic Gospels in which the Apostle John had a prominent role, like the call of the sons of Zebedee along the shore of Galilee, like the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, the raising of Jairus' daughter, the transfiguration, the Garden of Gethsemane, all these events in which a smaller group of apostles, and John being one of them, was present, none of these are mentioned in the Gospel of John. Nor is John's brother James ever mentioned in the fourth Gospel. And although the sons of Zebedee were Galilean fishermen, all interest in the region of Galilee is lacking in this gospel, for, as we mentioned before, it centers more around Jerusalem and Jesus' visit there. The so-called Gospel of John is also remarkable and surprising to be part of an Orthodox Gospel canon, because it appears that the first users of this Gospel in the 2nd century were Gnostic Christians. There was indeed a group in Asia Minor later who were opposed to the Gospel of John being part of the canon. They were called the Alogi, and they assert a tradition that it was written by the heretic Cerinthus. And it is in the midst of such controversies at the end of the 2nd and 3rd, in the 3rd century, where later tradition adds the name the Apostle John to this text, perhaps more to gain its acceptance in the wider church by those who liked it than as an actual historical memory of who actually wrote it. Indeed, it seems highly unlikely to me that John, the son of Zebedee, a Galilean fisherman, wrote this gospel for all the reasons previously stated. Note that the Alogi, a group of heterodox Christians, were called this, identified and labeled this by Bishop Epiphanius of Salamis, who coined that phrase, it appears, both to play on the words that they were being illogical, anti-logikos, as well as being against the Christian doctrine of the Logos, which is found exclusively in the Gospel of John. But this is late now. Epiphanius was a bishop in Cyprus at the end of the 4th century. But he quotes Hippolytus. Hippolytus, who's dated about 170 to 235, so the end of the 2nd century. Hippolytus is a fascinating character of the church, an important character, an important 3rd century Christian theologian. But his providence, where he's from, where he was bishop, his identity, and the details about his life, and even a collection of his writings, which are sometimes quoted by later fathers, but we don't have any original texts, they remain elusive to scholars and historians. Even of his day, or shortly after his day, the best historians of the early church, Eusebius in Caesarea and Jerome in Jerusalem, both early 4th century, openly confess that they cannot name where Hippolytus, the biblical commentator and theologian of the 2nd century, where he served his leadership, where he was from, what he was bishop of. Cerinthus is also known from other sources. He was a contemporary, apparently, of John the Presbyter, John the Elder, who indeed may have written the 2nd and 3rd epistles of John. Some think to warn the less mature in faith about doctrines and changes that Cerinthus was proposing to the Christian tradition and perhaps to the Gospel of John. So it's a controversial gospel in the 2nd and 3rd century. And only in the 4th century does it get widely accepted. We'll talk more about that in part 4. So the 4th gospel seems to identify its author, though anonymously, in a roundabout sort of way. At the end of the gospel, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the Last Supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that's going to betray you?" declares that he is the one testifying to these things, and he is the one who has written them down. And then some other we affirms that they know that his testimony is true. And then finally, he also notes that there were many other things that Jesus did that were not written down here. This affirmation at the end of the 4th gospel would suggest an eyewitness to Jesus as the writer of this gospel. So the question is, who was the disciple that Jesus loved? Later tradition, of course, will declare in the 4th century that it was John, the son of Zebedee, the apostle. Well, what clues does the 4th gospel itself provide? Well, the beloved disciple is specifically mentioned only in the 2nd half of the gospel. And although he's referred to there several times, he is never actually identified. It was the beloved disciple, for instance, who at Simon Peter's beckoning, lying there close to the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper, asked Jesus who it was after Jesus' announcement that someone would betray him. It also appears to have been the beloved disciple who was known to the high priest in Jerusalem and who spoke to the maid who kept the door at the gate of the high priest's courtyard, where he then entered during Jesus' trial and brought Simon Peter in with him, whereupon Simon Peter thrice denied ever knowing Jesus. It was also the beloved disciple alone among the men who followed Jesus who was there at the crucifixion, when all the others had fled and were scattered and hiding behind closed doors for fear of the Jewish authorities. And it was to the beloved disciple there at the foot of the cross that Jesus is said to have committed the care of his mother. Woman, behold your son. And to the beloved disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, we are told, that disciple took her to his home. The Galilean fisherman, John the son of Zebedee, could not have taken Jesus' mother Mary to his home in Galilee at that hour, as it was the sun was setting, and it was the Sabbath that was coming, which is why they rushed the crucifixion, why they broke the legs of the two thieves on either side to hasten their death, so they could take the bodies down before sunset, before the beginning of the Sabbath, which in the Synoptic Gospels is the beginning of the Passover. No, that's not right, but it is the Passover, the Sabbath of the Passover. It's the first Sabbath after the Passover. So it seems unlikely that that's the Apostle John and he could take her to his home at that very hour back in Galilee. Later tradition, of course, will suggest, unwarranted by any foundation, that John also had a home in Jerusalem. Similarly, how was John known to the high priest? It's unlikely that a Galilean fisherman would have been known. It was also the beloved disciple and Peter who ran to investigate the tomb, the empty tomb, after Mary Magdalene came back that fateful Easter morning reporting that the body had been taken. The beloved disciple, we are told in that gospel, reached the tomb first, but didn't go in, at least until after Peter had gone in. He hesitated at the door. And on their return home, we are told that the beloved disciple alone understood the significance of the empty tomb. And we are told, believed. For all the other disciples, the empty tomb suggested that someone had stolen the body, and they didn't know what to believe. Finally, it was the beloved disciple who, while fishing with the others, who first recognized the risen Jesus on the shore by the Sea of Tiberias. So who was this beloved disciple that figured so prominently in several of these stories, but always goes unnamed? Throughout the years, numerous individuals have been suggested as the real beloved disciple, like the presbyter John of Ephesus, which may be why the name John was associated with the gospel, which Irenaeus then later changed into not John the presbyter, but John the apostle to give it more apostolic authority. Or it may have been the apostle Matthias, some argued. Or some have argued that it was John Mark, again, explaining why the name John might have been associated with it. John Mark, the companion of Paul and the cousin of Barnabas, whose mother Mary had a house in Jerusalem where the Peter and John, when they escape from prison in Acts, go immediately there, and that's where they're gathering, suggested by some to have been the place of the Last Supper. But my favorite suggestion, Martin Luther also suggested this, but so did others, is that the beloved disciple was Lazarus. Indeed, Lazarus is the one person in the fourth gospel whom Jesus is specifically said to have loved, and it's said so repeatedly. And as we've seen, Jesus appears to have been a guest in the house of Lazarus and his sisters, Martha and Mary, on several different occasions. And thus, it is perhaps likely that Lazarus's house was the location of the Last Supper, and that Lazarus as host might then indeed have lain close to the breast of Jesus. Moreover, Lazarus's house, we know, was in Bethany, only 1.5 miles from Jerusalem, and near where the Garden of Gethsemane is traditionally thought to have been. And thus Lazarus could have easily taken Jesus' mother home to his house from the crucifixion at that very hour before the Sabbath began. As a native of Jerusalem, Lazarus is more likely to have been a friend of the high priest and his maid, and so to have been able to gain access into the courtyard during Jesus' trial. But perhaps, at least to me, most convincing is that Lazarus alone among all the others who would have been the one person who understood that what the empty tomb really meant. When he and Peter ran to discover it, and when he hesitated at the door. For Lazarus himself had laid in a tomb for 4 days and had been raised. He alone among the others might be the one likely to think not of a robbed grave as all the others did, but of a resurrected life. Lazarus alone would have been the one to see the empty tomb and believe. Perhaps that Lazarus is the real author of the fourth gospel is confirmed by the very last story told there, on the shores of the Sea of Tiberias, sometimes called the last breakfast or the first breakfast, where Jesus is on the shore and they're out catching fish, and he guides them and they come in and have breakfast with him. Where Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, 3 times asked Simon Peter whether he loved him, and then tells him to go and feed his sheep, and then reveals to Peter the kind of death he would suffer. And that after that, as Jesus and Peter were walking away from the others, Peter asked, what about this guy, the disciple whom Jesus loved, who was following them? And how is he to die? And Jesus enigmatically replied, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? And we are told in the gospel that the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. A rumor that could have easily been spread about Lazarus, since he had already died and had been raised. But the author of the fourth gospel apparently knew his own mortality and tried to put a stop to that rumor by going on and denying that that's what Jesus meant. Lazarus might have known the difference between his death and Jesus' death. Lazarus might have suspected that one day he would again fill his own empty grave, but that Jesus would not. Lazarus' life was resuscitated. Jesus being resurrected was something else, something different, entirely different. Jesus' resurrection revealed the meaning of eternal life, and how appropriate it is that the theme of the fourth gospel is eternal life, where Jesus is portrayed as the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live, and whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. So, in summary, the 4 canonical gospels, so-called of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, appear to be our earliest written extant sources about the life of Jesus. But they're not necessarily the oldest literary texts about the life of Jesus. They themselves acknowledge that others were known. And there are other gospels known and quoted by the early church fathers, like the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of Mary, or the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945. Other written texts were mentioned, like those at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, as being known at the time our Gospels were written. But they may not be known to us now. And there may be even other sources speculated about, like Q or L or M. The author of the so-called Gospel of Luke acknowledged that there were many such accounts, and biblical scholars suggest that the author of Luke did indeed have the written Gospel of what we call Mark, in front of him, and another written source, which we call Q, as they wrote their own Gospel, and maybe other sources too. So none of our canonical Gospels were written by any of the apostles or the companions of the early church, like Peter or Paul, with the possible exception of the Gospel called John, which has the strongest claims to have been written by an actual disciple of Jesus, though in a roundabout way. Unlike the Gospel of Thomas, which simply declares itself that this is written down. These are the sayings told to Jesus, by Jesus to the apostle Thomas the twin. So the question is, how do we decide what to believe, or which to believe, or what is true, or what is not, or what later tradition says and what the texts themselves say? And who decided that these 4 texts that we have would be part of the Christian canon, or the list of books in the Christian Bible, but not the others. And when was that decision made? And how was it made? Based on what? Those are the questions I'm left with at the end of this part, looking at our 4 canonical Gospels. So in the next chapter or class of this adult Bible study, let's look at I think the next obvious question one has to consider after we've considered translation, we've considered the textual manuscripts and sources of our translations. Now we've looked a little more closely at the 4 canonical Gospels. The question is, what do we really know about these Gospels and how they became part of the canon, and when they became canonical, and why they became canonical? You already see the controversy about the Gospel of John in the comments made here. So that's what we'll look at next time. Meanwhile, I hope you found this class helpful, and you'll join us next time. Until then, God bless and good night.